Hi there, and welcome to Out There, a Cryptid podcast. I'm Josh, and today we're talking about a 1,000-year-old lake monster from Russia, tied to vanishing boats, whispered legends, and a body of water people genuinely fear, known as the Brosno Dragon. Let's dive in. We've got some exciting news to share. Out There is now officially on video. Every episode is being recorded, and you can watch the full show on our YouTube channel at Out There Cryptids. Videos will be posted the same day each episode premieres, for the most part, so every Thursday you can choose to listen or to watch. You know, for a show that's covered cryptids, UFOs, hauntings, and all kinds of strange encounters, we've somehow never covered a dragon before. This one does technically fit into a lake monster for sure, but what makes this case different is that the creature tied to this lake isn't just described as a monster in the water. In its folklore, it's explicitly referred to as a dragon. Not a misidentified animal or a vague shape beneath the surface, but a creature with intelligence, aggression, and intention. That makes this the first episode where we're covering something classified as a dragon in name, in legend, and in how it's been feared for centuries. But before we get into dragons, legends, and lake monsters, we need to talk about the place itself. Because with stories like this, the setting matters just as much as the creature. Lake Brosno is located in western Russia, in the Tver Oblast, roughly halfway between Moscow and St. Petersburg. It is located only a few miles outside of a town called Andriopol. The lake sits just off historic trade and travel routes that have been used for centuries. Even though it isn't remote wilderness, Lake Brosno has always had an uneasy reputation among locals. The lake itself is relatively small, but deceptively deep. At its deepest point, the lake reaches around 40 meters, or roughly 130 feet. The water is dark and murky, with extremely low visibility, and the bottom is uneven and layered with thick sediment. The lake was formed thousands of years ago, most likely during the last ice age, when retreating glaciers carved out depressions across this part of Russia. Over time, organic material built up at the bottom of the lake, creating conditions where methane gas can form and occasionally escape to the surface. These gas releases can disturb the water, kill fish, and in some cases even affect boats. Because of all of this, locals have known for generations that this isn't a safe lake. People avoid swimming here, fishermen keep their distance from certain areas, and long before anyone ever talked about cryptids, there was already a deep fear of what might be lurking beneath the surface. And that fear is where the legend begins. So, now that we know what kind of lake we're dealing with, let's talk about the creature that's said to live there, the Brosno Dragon itself. Descriptions vary depending on who you ask, but most accounts agree on a few key details. People describe it as serpent-like, sometimes more fully dragon-shaped, with a long, flexible neck and a large, menacing head. Witnesses say they've seen it breaching the surface of the lake, rising like some living sculpture out of the dark water. The stories aren't just about sightings. The Brosno Dragon is said to be aggressive. Folklore tells of it attacking boats, dragging animals, and sometimes people under the surface, leaving behind chaos and fear. It's not just a massive monster hiding in the depths. It's a creature with purpose, at least in the stories. Some versions of the lore even describe the creature's silhouette as more than just a mysterious shape in murky water. The dragon was described with a gaping mouth and serpent body, sometimes shown in stories as intercepting livestock that grazed near the shoreline and dragging them into the depths without warning. These descriptions helped cement the Brosno Dragon, not just as a rumor, but as a creature that was genuinely feared and respected among the rural communities around the lake. What's especially fascinating is that these legends don't come from modern cryptid culture. They predate it by centuries. This isn't a story born out of newspaper sensationalism, television shows, or internet forums. For generations, the people around Lake Brosno have passed down the tales of this dragon, long before the idea of lake monsters entered pop culture. The fear, the respect, and the stories themselves are ancient, which gives the legend a weight that most modern cryptids don't have. The Brosno Dragon isn't just a modern curiosity. Its legend stretches far back into history, spanning from ancient tales to medieval and Tsarist-era Russia. One of the oldest and most famous stories involves a Roman military unit. According to the local legend, sometime around the 1st century CE, a Roman detachment attempted to cross the lake. The soldiers reportedly vanished beneath the waters, allegedly dragged under by a monstrous creature. As one version of the story goes, quote, "The men marched across the frozen lake, but when they reached its center, the ice broke, and a terrible beast rose, dragging them to the depths." End quote. While there's no historical evidence that Roman soldiers were even in this area, this tale is often cited as an origin story for the lake's fearsome reputation. The legend continued through the Middle Ages and into the Tsarist era, which was from roughly 1547 to 1917. Local records and oral histories describe fishermen and villagers avoiding certain areas of the lake, claiming that livestock would disappear, boats would capsize without explanation, and strange shapes would be glimpsed under the water's surface. Some church documents from the 17th and 16th centuries warn of unusual events at the lake. One parish record from 1602 states, "Beware the waters of Brosno, where evil dwells and claims what it will." Now, these accounts do not explicitly name a dragon, but they show a long-standing cultural fear that is tied to this lake. Even in the 18th and 19th centuries, travelers and local authorities documented mysterious occurrences, from waves rising without wind to the disappearance of animals, and this was just reinforced its reputation as a dangerous place. Across centuries, the stories share consistent threads. The creature is aggressive, dragging animals or capsizing boats. It appears as a long-necked serpent or dragon, and locals are repeatedly warned to stay away from certain parts of the lake. What's interesting is that these legends have continued despite any physical evidence. There is another more ancient story tied to the legend of the Brosno Dragon, and it is also one of the most dramatic tales tied to the lake from the 13th century. According to local lore, Batu Khan, the Mongol commander whose forces were advancing toward Novgorod, led his army near Lake Brosno. The troops stopped to rest, and their horses drank from the dark, murky water. But, as the animals drank, something massive was beneath the surface. Out of nowhere rose a huge, roaring creature, described in some versions as a dragon or serpent. It struck without warning, attacking both horses and soldiers. The Mongol troops were terrified by what they saw, and reportedly took it as an ominous sign. Batu Khan himself allegedly ordered the army to retreat, abandoning that part of their campaign, rather than risking any other encounters with whatever was in the lake. Now, it's important to note that there's no historical record of this event in the chronicles of Batu Khan's campaign. Historians know the Mongols did move through what is now Russia in the 1230s, but there's no evidence of a real battle or event at Lake Brosno. We get this story through the oral traditions of locals, and the stories that get passed down through centuries, warning of this creature that dwells in the lake, powerful enough to frighten even an army. As the stories of the Brosno Dragon spread through the centuries, the creature began to take on some more vivid and terrifying details in the oral traditions. In the generations after the Mongol army tale, villagers and fishermen along the shores of Lake Brosno spoke about a beast with an, quote, enormous mouth, end quote, a creature so massive and fearsome that it was said to devour fishermen who stood too close to the water's edge. Older legends told travelers and hunters who would avoid certain parts of the lake because of the unexplained splashes or huge shapes moving below the surface. And to be clear, apparently, these were not casual ripples from wind or fish. They were the movements of something huge, something with enormous power, and enough to unsettle even the seasoned locals. And the thing is, these stories didn't just stay in the realm of campfire tales. Over time, that fear of the lake became part of everyday life for people who lived around it. In medieval times, and later into the Tsarist era, there are references in local church language to something evil or unclean connected to the waters of Lake Brosno. They don't outright say, there's a dragon in the lake, but they don't really need to. The message is clear. This is not a safe place. Whatever was in the lake didn't want to be disturbed. By the 18th and 19th centuries, this wasn't treated like some far-fetched legend anymore. Travelers passing through the region wrote about how locals talked about the lake with total seriousness. Not fear-mongering, not joking, just matter of fact. Lake Brosno was dangerous, and the dragon, whether literal or symbolic, had become the explanation everyone accepted. By the 1990s, the Brosno Dragon wasn't just old folklore anymore. People living around Lake Brosno were still seeing things in the water, and this time, reporters were taking notes. Regional newspapers in the Tver Oblast published accounts from locals describing dark, reptile-like heads rising briefly from the surface, sometimes followed by movement beneath the water that didn't look like a fish or a log. One witness even described it as, quote, a living mass, end quote, gliding just below the surface. Among these reports, one of the most cited witnesses was a local woman named Tanya. She told journalists, quote, I only saw the head of this creature, so I was not scared at all, end quote. She pointed out the exact spot on the lake where she saw it and sketched what she saw. A large head with a long body disappearing back beneath the water. What stands out is how matter-of-fact she sounded. She didn't dramatize the encounter. To her, the creature was just part of the lake's unpredictable character. There is a story that really captured people's attention in the early 2000s. A small recreational boat or yacht allegedly sank on Lake Brosno under mysterious circumstances. Locals claimed that just before it went under, a massive object surfaced near the vessel, causing waves and disturbances that couldn't be explained by wind or current. There are no official records confirming a creature caused the sinking, but the incident quickly became part of local lore. Witnesses insisted that the boat was otherwise seaworthy, and that conditions were calm, which only deepened the mystery. The story of the sunken boat added a new layer of fear. If something could drag a vessel under, it wasn't just a creature glimpsed briefly on the surface. It was powerful enough to affect the lake itself. Later that same decade, in 2002, a Russian research group known for investigating UFOs decided to scan the lake with sonar, partly inspired by these mysterious boat incidences. The team reported a large, jelly-like figure moving in the depths. While it was enough to make some wonder if the Brosno Dragon had finally been detected, the group ultimately concluded it wasn't a monster. Scientists later suggested the readings were likely caused by hydrogen sulfide gas building up at the bottom of the lake. When released, this gas rises in thick, shifting clouds that can disturb the surface and even register on sonar, creating the illusion of something alive. Some researchers also point to geological fissures or volcanic cracks beneath the lake as a source of the gas, explaining the sudden bubbles, surface ripples, and eerie smells locals sometimes report. Even if the creature wasn't confirmed, the combination of eyewitness accounts, Tanya's sketches, and the mysterious boat sinking with this sonar anomaly ensures that the lake feels alive with even possibility. And when you add in the creature's stories, disappearances of livestock, and local avoidance of certain areas, it's easy to see why Lake Brosno has maintained its reputation as a place where something strange, or maybe even dangerous, could still be hiding. But of course, just because people see something doesn't mean it's a monster. Because there are a few ways all of these sightings could be explained. When you look at all of the sightings and stories, the first explanation is the simplest. It could just be folklore that grew over time. Lake Brosno has been a place of fear and mystery for centuries. You combine that with the lake's unusual characteristics like murky water, deep sections, sudden waves, and logs or debris floating on the surface. It's easy to see how these could have sparked imagination. Fishermen might see a wave caused by wind or a fallen tree drifting, and over time that could turn into a story about a massive creature lurking beneath the surface. Even the sunken boat incident could have been exaggerated by fear or explained by a natural accident in an unpredictable lake. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures, and when something already has a reputation for danger, the mind tends to fill in the blanks. The second explanation leans on what we already know exists in the lake: large real animals. One candidate often suggested is the European sturgeon. Sturgeon are prehistoric-looking fish that can grow up to 7 to 8 feet long, sometimes heavier, with a broad body and long snout. They live in deep freshwater lakes and rivers across Europe and Russia, including regions near Lake Brosno. A sturgeon breaching the surface, especially in murky water, could easily look like a dragon's head or a long serpentine body, especially to someone not expecting to see one. Other animals could also account for sightings. Large pike or catfish can appear unexpectedly in the shadows, creating splashes. Even swans or groups of ducks in a line can form shapes that look unusual from a distance. Even otters or beavers moving quickly near the surface could produce the effect of a single long creature gliding across the water. In other words, there are a lot of real animals that can be misidentified under the right conditions. And yet, there's a reason the legend persists. Some sightings, like Tanya's clear view of the head, the sonar anomaly in 2002, reports of large objects moving in deep, calm water, are difficult to explain completely with just folklore or known animals. Combine that with the consistency of descriptions across centuries, the boat sinking story, and the local avoidance of the lake, and it starts to make you wonder if something unusual really is down there. Maybe it's a creature that science hasn't documented yet. Maybe it's something ancient and elusive, like a prehistoric fish unknown to modern biology. Or maybe, for whatever reason, the lake itself creates illusions so convincing that even skeptical locals begin to believe in a monster. The truth is, Lake Brosno has kept its secrets for centuries, and nobody has disproven the possibility entirely. So, here's my take on the Brosno Dragon. Lake monsters are notoriously tricky to make sense of, especially when you start thinking about biology. For something to live in a lake like Brosno and be as big as people describe, it would need a lot of food. Sturgeon, catfish, or even huge fish populations probably couldn't support a multi-ton predator, especially one that's supposedly attacking boats or livestock. Then there's the question of reproduction. If there's only one or a few of these creatures, how do they reproduce without serious inbreeding problems? You'd need a population large enough to sustain genetic diversity, which would also make it harder for them to remain hidden for centuries. On the other hand, the sightings are oddly consistent. From medieval legends to Our Girl Tanya in the 1990s, and even the sonar anomaly in 2002. People keep describing something long, dark, and moving in the lake. And while things like logs, waves, or even sturgeons could explain a lot, they don't perfectly account for everything. Like the way some witnesses swear they saw a head rise above the water and linger, or even sudden disturbances that may have sunk a boat. So, my conclusion, I think it's probably a combination of things. Most sightings are likely exaggerations or misidentifications influenced by the folklore and the natural lake phenomena. But there's enough odd, repeated, and unexplained details that I wouldn't dismiss the possibility of something unusual living in the depths entirely. Whatever it is, it's clever enough to remain a mystery for centuries. And that's where the story of the Lake Brosno Dragon really ends. A lake with centuries of fear, modern sightings, strange sonar readings, and just enough unanswered questions to keep the legend alive. But before we wrap up the episode, I want to zoom out a bit. For the rest of this episode, I'm going to talk about what a real lake monster would actually need in order to survive. Not to say that lake monsters are all fake, and not to dismiss the people who genuinely believe they've seen something. Instead, this is about trying to rationalize how something like this could even be possible. Because if creatures like the Brosno Dragon are real, and if they're supposed to survive for generations like so many legends claim, then there are certain biological and environmental rules that they'd have to follow. And that's where the things get really interesting. If we are going to seriously talk about the possibility of a real lake monster, the biggest hurdle is the population size and reproduction. The idea of a single creature surviving for thousands or even millions of years just does not work biologically. Even animals known for extreme lifespans fall far short of that. For a species to exist long term, there has to be a breeding population, not just one monster hiding in the water. From a genetic standpoint, scientists generally agree that you would need at least dozens, and more realistically, hundreds of individuals over time to avoid severe inbreeding. Without enough genetic diversity, a population would quickly suffer from deformities, infertility, or simply die out with a few generations. And when you accept that there would need to be multiple large animals living in the same lake at the same time, it does become much harder to explain how they could remain completely hidden. More creatures means more chances for bones, bodies, waste, physical evidence, or repeated sightings to eventually surface. The next major issue is food supply and energy needs. Size really matters here. A large aquatic predator would need a constant, high-calorie food source just to survive, let alone thrive. That means the fish populations in the lake would have to be large enough not only to exist, but to replenish faster than the creature could consume them over time. If the creature were carnivorous, we would expect to see some pretty obvious signs. Fish populations would noticeably decline, their behavior or migration patterns would change, and there would be a clear disturbance in the food web. And if the creature were omnivores, or even partially herbivores, it would still require massive amounts of vegetation to sustain its size. That kind of constant feeding would dramatically alter the lake's ecosystem. Either way, the lake would show signs of long-term ecological stress, and at Lake Brosno, there is no strong evidence of that kind of imbalance. Another important factor is physical evidence over time, and this is something that often gets overlooked. If large animals have truly lived in a lake for centuries, we should eventually find something left behind. That could be shed skin, scales, or teeth. It could be bones or partial remains. It could even be clear bite marks on fish or other animals, or consistent physical disturbances in the same areas of the lake, which do happen in some of these stories. Even the most elusive species leave evidence behind eventually. Animals die, they shed parts of their bodies, and they interact with their environments in ways that leave traces. When decades or centuries pass without any physical proof turning up, that absence starts to matter. The longer the timeline, the harder it becomes to explain how a large population could exist without leaving behind something undeniable. Another major consideration is environmental constraints. Lakes are closed systems. Unlike oceans, they have limited space, limited oxygen, and limited food. Large animals are especially sensitive to changes in oxygen levels, seasonal freezing, and the temperature shifts throughout the year. These factors alone would make long-term survival difficult for anything large and unknown. At Lake Brosno specifically, there's also the issue of gas releases, including hydrogen sulfide that builds up at the bottom of the lake and occasionally rises to the surface. Any creature living there long-term would need to be extraordinarily resilient to survive those conditions again and again. And if something that large and adaptable had been living there for generations, we would expect to see signs of that resilience reflected in the ecosystem itself. So far, those signs just are not clear enough. The last major challenge for lake monsters is detection in the modern era. This is where things really start to break down. Between sonar scans, regular fishing activity, scientific surveys, satellite imagery, and environmental DNA sampling, it has become increasingly difficult for large unknown animals to remain completely hidden. Even when animals themselves are not seen, their DNA shows up in water samples. Environmental DNA testing has become one of the most reliable ways to detect species living in a body of water, even at low population levels. So far, there has been no confirmed DNA evidence pointing to an unknown large species living in lakes like Brosno. That absence of evidence does not automatically disprove every sighting, but it does present a serious obstacle for lake monster theories as a whole. When it comes to lake monsters in general, I think this is where I usually land. Not in a place of outright disbelief, but in a place of realism. Lakes are fascinating, but they are also limited environments. For something large and unknown to survive in one for generations, it would need to meet some very strict biological and environmental requirements. And more often than not, the evidence just does not quite get us there. That said, I don't think all lake monster stories come from nothing. People really do see strange things in the water. Lakes can create powerful illusions, sudden movement, and unexplained disturbances that feel alive, especially in places that already carry a reputation for danger or mystery. Over time, these experiences turn into stories, and those stories turn into legends. So, maybe lake monsters are not ancient creatures hiding just beneath the surface. Maybe they are the result of real experiences, even with a real creature like a sturgeon, mixed with fear, environment, and a little imagination. Or maybe there still is something out there that science has not fully explained yet. Either way, the fact that these stories keep appearing all over the world says something. But I will say before we go, you know where monsters could realistically live? In our oceans. But that's for another time. So, what do you think? Is the Brosno Dragon really out there? Be sure to follow us on Instagram @OutThereCryptids for episode posts, updates, and more. Join our community on Discord, where we dive even deeper into the mysteries we explore here on the podcast. The link can be found on our Instagram. And if you're loving the show, consider supporting us on Patreon. As a patron, you get exclusive perks like bonus episodes, early access, and even surprises. See you next week.